A Mustang dragged from the desert should have been just another auction lot. Wild, dangerous, forgettable. But when the scarred stallion bent his knee before a man named Ethan Walker, the crowd fell silent. What followed was not a simple story of taming a horse, but of a haunted brother, a boy with hope, and a land that refuses to forget. Some say the desert keeps its secrets. This time, it was ready to give one back. The desert at dusk had a way of swallowing sound. Out beyond the mesas of northern New Mexico, the wind carried dust across the ridges like a veil, covering the land in a restless silence. The sun hung low, its light the color of dying embers, burning orange against the wide, unbroken sky. Out there, between sandstone cliffs and brittle sagebrush, a chase was unfolding. 3 men rode hard, ropes coiled tight in their hands, their horses snorting and sweating under the strain. The target was not just any wild Mustang, but a chestnut stallion with a scar running down the length of his neck. He moved with the violence of a storm, kicking up sand, muscles rippling beneath a coat that shimmered like copper fire. Each time the ropes swung near, he cut away like wind through a canyon. "Damn ghost horse," muttered one of the wranglers, his hat nearly ripped off by the gusts. "Ain't natural the way he moves." The stallion's eyes flashed in the dimming light, dark, defiant, and filled with something that unsettled even seasoned men. There was no fear in him, only resistance, a wild refusal to yield. When he struck the earth with his hooves, the sound cracked like thunder. The scar at his neck caught the sun one last time before the ropes finally closed in. The wranglers whooped and strained, horses skidding in the gravel as they pulled the stallion to a stop. He reared, rope burns scoring his skin, dust swirling high into the cooling air. It was like watching fire forced into a cage. Yet somehow, through the fury, there was still dignity in the way he held himself, as if he allowed capture, not out of weakness, but out of choice. By the time they dragged him back toward town, the desert had gone quiet again, the last sliver of sun swallowed by the horizon. The men spoke little. Glance at the stallion's eyes left them uneasy, as though they hadn't just caught a horse, but something else, something old the desert had been keeping for itself. The next morning, the town of San Isidro buzzed with rumor. The Mustang had been penned in the holding yard by the auction barn, and word spread like wildfire through the diner booths and feed stores. Folks called him the Phantom of Mesa Ridge. Some swore they'd seen him before, standing alone on a ridge at sunset, watching without moving until he vanished into the rocks. Others claimed no bullet nor rope could ever hold him. By midday, the crowd had gathered. Families, ranchers, old men with walking sticks, young kids perched on fences, their voices clattering together with the hum of gossip. The smell of dust and sweat mixed with the tang of roasted peanuts from a nearby stand. Overhead the sky was sharp and blue, but the air felt heavy, as if carrying the weight of something unspoken. The stallion stood inside the corral, ropes tied tight, muscles tense under the July heat. He struck the earth once, twice, the sound echoing like a drumbeat. His ears flicked back and forth, nostrils wide. He did not pace. He did not beg. He simply stared at the crowd, as though he were the one appraising them. People grew quieter the longer they watched him. There was something unnatural about that stillness, a sharp intelligence behind the dark eyes. A girl whispered to her mother, "He's not scared." The auctioneer, a man who had sold everything from goats to tractors, tried to keep the mood light. "Heard they call him the Phantom. Guess he ain't no ghost if he's standing right here." A few chuckles rippled weakly, but no one truly laughed. The stallion shifted his weight, scar glinting, and the laughter died like a flame snuffed out by wind. From the back of the crowd, an old ranch hand muttered, "Best leave that one be. Desert's got a way of putting spirits in things." But the wranglers had brought him here to be sold, and the auction would proceed. They had no idea that what was about to happen would ripple through the town, through lives that had been stuck in silence for far too long. The stallion lowered his head, eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, no one breathed. And then, sudden, startling, he bent one knee and dropped into the dirt. The sound of gasps cut through the air. Children clung tighter to their parents. Men removed their hats without realizing. The stallion stayed bowed, chest heaving slow and steady as if waiting. The silence was complete now, heavier than any sermon or graveyard hush. From somewhere within that silence, a voice rose soft, uncertain, almost trembling. "Dad, he's looking at you." The words came from a boy at the edge of the pen, his hand gripping his father's arm. The man, broad-shouldered, gray streaking through his hair, eyes tired from years of carrying weight he never spoke of, shifted uncomfortably. His name was Ethan Walker. He hadn't planned to be here. But now, as the stallion's gaze locked on his, the world seemed to narrow until only the two of them remained. Ethan felt the air catch in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but in the depths of those dark eyes, he saw not just defiance, not just fire, but recognition. Something he hadn't felt since the day he lost his younger brother in a blaze of smoke and flame years ago. The crowd waited for someone to speak, for the spell to break, but no one moved. The stallion stayed bowed, Ethan frozen, his son Jonah tugging at his sleeve. And just before the auctioneer cleared his throat and the world exhaled again, Ethan whispered under his breath, words he hadn't meant to say out loud. "I've seen you before." The auction ended with murmurs still floating in the heat, the stallion's bowed figure etched into every witness's memory. Ethan Walker didn't stay to see the paperwork finished. He guided his son Jonah through the crowd, boots crunching against the gravel, his breath shallow, as if each step pressed against a wound long hidden. Ethan hadn't meant to be back in San Isidro for more than a week, let alone caught in something like this. He had driven into town on errands, needing supplies for the run-down property he had inherited after his parents passed. The small house sat on the edge of the desert, roof sagging, fences falling into dust. It was not a home, not yet. It was simply a place where he might try to be invisible. But San Isidro was not a town that forgot its own. People still recognized him, the man who had once fought wildfires across Arizona, the man who had come back burned, not in body, but in spirit. That evening, when he parked his old pickup near the house, the desert twilight hung soft around him. Jonah hopped out, lanky legs clumsy, harmonica sticking from his pocket. The boy had a quiet resilience about him, an openness Ethan both envied and feared. Jonah didn't know what it meant to lose someone in smoke and chaos. He hadn't been there when Ethan's younger brother Caleb never came back from the ridge. He only knew his father carried silence like a second skin. "Dad," Jonah said as they walked toward the porch, "why did he look at you like that? The horse, I mean." Ethan set his jaw, fumbling for his keys. The scar of memory pressed hot against his chest. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "Sometimes animals do strange things." Jonah frowned, but didn't push. He had learned early that some doors in his father's life stayed closed no matter how hard he knocked. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Ethan set down the groceries, his eyes drawn unwillingly to the framed photograph leaning against the wall. Never hung. Caleb stood there, younger, laughing, his arm slung around Ethan's shoulder. Behind them stretched a wildfire-blackened sky. Ethan turned the frame face down, unable to meet those eyes tonight. The silence grew heavy until the sound of tires crunching gravel broke it. A small SUV pulled up, headlights cutting through the dark. Jonah pressed against the window. "It's her," he said, excitement creeping into his voice. Dr. Lila Johnson stepped out, her hair tied back loosely, a worn leather bag slung over her shoulder. She was new to San Isidro, having left Kentucky to work as a veterinarian in this forgotten corner of the Southwest. People didn't quite know what to make of her yet. Educated, confident, but with a kind of gentleness that unsettled the hardened ranchers. She waved as she approached, dust clinging to her boots. "Evening," she called softly. "I thought you might want to know. They couldn't get anyone to bid high enough. The stallion's yours, Ethan." Ethan froze on the porch. "Mine? I didn't sign anything." "They signed it for you. Someone had to take responsibility. Otherwise, he was going to the state pens, maybe worse." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "You don't want to know what happens to horses that end up there." Jonah's eyes lit up. "We get to keep him." Ethan rubbed a hand across his face. "We don't need a wild horse. We don't even have the fences fixed. He's dangerous, Jonah." But Jonah didn't hear the warning. He was already halfway down the steps, excitement in every stride. "Dad?" He looked at you, like he knew you. "You can't just send him away." Lila placed the bag on the porch rail, her gaze steady on Ethan. "I've seen hundreds of Mustangs, Ethan. None like this one. He doesn't act out of fear. He acts out of knowing. You felt it too. Don't tell me you didn't." The desert night seemed to tighten around them, cicadas buzzing in the dark. Ethan clenched his fists, every muscle resisting the truth. But deep inside, something had already shifted. The horse had looked at him, not through him, but into him, like a mirror he had long avoided. Later, after Lila left, Ethan sat on the porch with Jonah asleep inside. The stars spread overhead, sharp and countless. He nursed a coffee gone cold, staring at the horizon where the mesas rose like silent sentinels. He thought of Caleb, his laugh, his reckless courage, the way he had ridden into the smoke that day, as if the fire couldn't touch him. And Ethan thought of the stallion, eyes dark as midnight, scar gleaming like memory itself carved into flesh. The desert wind brushed against him, warm and restless. Ethan whispered to no one, to nothing. "I didn't come back here for this." Yet even as he said it, he knew the desert had called him home for a reason, and the reason had eyes like fire and shadows that would not let him go. The morning of the auction rose slow and heavy, the desert painted in pale lavender and gold. San Isidro had not seen such a gathering in years. Trucks lined the dirt road outside the old barn, their tailgates down, men leaning against them with coffee cups, steaming in the cool dawn. The town had grown restless since news spread of the captured Mustang, the one they called the Phantom of Mesa Ridge. Curiosity burned hotter than the July sun. Inside the barn, the air was thick with dust and the mingled scent of hay and oil. Wooden rafters creaked above, pigeons fluttering in the shadows. The stallion stood inside the pen, tethered but unbroken. His scar caught the light through the slats, and his breath came in long, measured pulls, misting faintly in the cool shade. Children perched on their father's shoulders to get a better view, whispers buzzing like insects. The auctioneer, Bert McKinley, tapped the microphone with a stubby finger. He had spent 30 years selling everything from plows to prime cattle, but today his voice cracked as he tried to keep it light. "Ladies and gentlemen, feast your eyes. Not every day the desert gives up a ghost." A few chuckles rose, thin and uncertain. The stallion stamped his hoof once, and silence fell again like a curtain. Ethan Walker stood near the back, Jonah by his side. He had not planned to be here, but Jonah insisted. The boy's eyes shone with a stubborn light, the same kind Caleb once carried. Ethan shifted his weight, uneasy under the weight of memories. He could feel the crowd's attention drawn to the stallion like iron filings to a magnet, and yet every so often, those dark eyes found him in the sea of faces. When the bidding began, it was half-hearted. Men shook their heads, muttered about danger, about fences not tall enough, about the trouble a wild horse could bring. A low price was called, then another, until the barn fell awkwardly quiet. No one wanted to claim the phantom. And then it happened. The stallion's muscles rippled as he shifted. Without warning, he bent one knee and sank into the dirt. The crowd gasped, hats lifted from heads, hands frozen halfway through motions. It wasn't a stumble. It wasn't exhaustion. It was deliberate, slow, almost reverent. His eyes rose, locking again with Ethan's across the barn. Jonah's hand gripped Ethan's arm. "Dad," he whispered, voice trembling with awe. "He's kneeling for you." Ethan felt the world tilt. His throat closed, and for a heartbeat he could not move. The barn, the murmurs, the auctioneer's nervous laughter, all of it blurred. There was only the horse, bowed in dust, and the memory of Caleb riding into the flames so many years ago. For one terrifying moment, it was as if his brother's spirit looked back at him through those dark eyes. "Sold!" Bert McKinley's gavel struck wood, jolting the silence. "Walker family takes the lot. Congratulations, Ethan." Ethan spun toward the platform. "I didn't bid," he protested, but the words fell flat against the tide of murmurs. Men were already nodding, some relieved, some uneasy. In their minds, it made sense. The phantom had chosen, and who were they to argue with the desert? Jonah beamed, gripping his father's sleeve. "He's ours, Dad. You can't fight it. He chose you." Ethan shook his head, his pulse pounding. "We can't keep him, Jonah. He's not tame. He's not—" But Jonah didn't let go. Maybe he's not supposed to be tame. The crowd began to disperse, leaving Ethan with the echo of his son's words and the weight of the stallion's unblinking gaze. Outside, the heat rose in shimmering waves, and Ethan felt the desert pressing closer, as if the land itself had pulled him into a story he didn't want to tell. That evening, as the stallion was led toward the Walker property, neighbors watched from their porches. Whispers followed. Talk of omens, of signs, of the desert reclaiming what was lost. Ethan ignored them, jaw tight, but his hands shook as he gripped the worn steering wheel of his pickup. Jonah leaned out the window, eyes never leaving the stallion. "He's not just a horse, Dad," he said softly. "He's waiting." Ethan didn't answer. The desert stretched wide ahead, quiet and endless. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the past closing in, not in memory alone, but in flesh, bone, and breath, standing there on 4 legs, carrying a scar like a reminder carved by fire. They brought the stallion home, in the hush that follows rumor, that low-tide quiet, when a town runs out of things to say, but still keeps listening. The trailer rattled like a hymn, with no words. Dust rose behind Ethan's pickup in a copper ribbon, the sun sliding down the sky until it touched the mesas with a last, tired glow. At the Walker place, fences leaned like old men resting on canes. The big cottonwood by the well clicked its leaves in the desert breeze, and the porch, its paint long surrendered to weather, took the weight of Ethan's boots as he stepped down. The air smelled of dry hay, machine oil, and the iron tang that rides in on a hot evening. He heard Jonah hop from the truck with the uncareful eagerness of 14, the boy's sneakers scuffing dust in quick, excited bursts. The trailer door swung open with a metal groan. The stallion stood inside like a held breath, muscles tight, eyes dark and alert. The scar at his neck caught a splinter of light. He didn't rear. He didn't throw himself against the rail. He simply waited, head high, like a traveler who already knew the way, who had stopped only because the road asked him to. "Easy," Ethan said, his voice low, steady, a tone he'd once used on a fire that didn't deserve it. He felt the old instinct return. Set your stance wide, know your exits, listen to what the living thing in front of you is telling you without words. The stallion's ears angled forward, measuring him. They eased him into the small corral behind the barn, a square of wire panels that would have made a colt roll his eyes. Ethan checked the corner posts, then double-wired a joint with hands that remembered other emergency fixes. Tarp on a torn roof, hoses knotted together to reach a stubborn blaze. He tried not to think of how many places a wild Mustang could find a weakness. Lila pulled up as the trailer clanged shut. She took in the place with a glance. The listing fence, the shallow trough, the shed roof that needed replacing, and set her leather bag on the top rail as if it had always been there. "He's dehydrated," she said softly. "Let's give him water and space. No crowding." Jonah had already filled the trough. The stallion stepped toward it, not in a rush, but with a measured inevitability, as if thirst mattered less than dignity. He drank, lips barely rippling the surface. When he lifted his head, a thin line of water traced his jaw and fell to the dust with a sound Ethan felt in his chest. Neighbors drifted by in pairs, then threes, their silhouettes framed by the red falling light. Some lifted hands in half-hearted waves. Some kept their distance, curiosity and caution doing their old dance. Ethan heard the whispers. A ghost horse choosing a man like that, Caleb's brother. Maybe trouble follows trouble. He didn't turn. Pride and weariness held an uneasy truce in him. He had no spare room for either. When the shadows lengthened, Lila stepped closer to the corral, her hands open and empty. "I'll check the burn marks from the ropes. They're not bad, but they'll sting tonight." She spoke to Ethan without looking away from the stallion. "May I?" "Your call," he said. He hated how his voice kept finding the careful register you use with a thunderhead. Lila moved in slow arcs, each footfall announced to the horse before it landed. She didn't break eye contact, didn't reach fast or straight. The stallion watched her approach with a monarch's patience, sizing, considering, until the space between them became a taut string that could either sing or snap. Lila stopped one breath short of that line. She turned her shoulder, made herself smaller, and let silence do the work. A minute passed. Another. Then the stallion lowered his head half an inch. Permission enough. Her fingers slid along the neck, skimming the heat under the hide, pausing at the scar where hair refused to grow. She whispered something Jonah couldn't catch, and Ethan pretended not to want to. When she stepped back, the stallion did not follow, but neither did he retreat. "He's not going to strike first," Lila said, as if reporting weather. "He's the kind that tells you what he'll do and then does it. That's rare." "Rare is another word for expensive," Ethan muttered. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. The month's bills sat folded in the kitchen drawer like a stack of unmailed apologies. Feed, diesel, repairs, county taxes that seemed to regenerate like creosote after rain. He thought of the old mortgage still nipping his heels, the kind of refinance he kept postponing because paperwork felt like admitting defeat. He thought of insurance notices and interest rates written in a language that never forgave. This wasn't the year for a horse with a story. It wasn't even the year for a horse. Lila heard what he didn't say. "I can reach out to a sanctuary in Colorado," she offered. "If you want out, they'll vet him, place him right. No rodeo strings attached. No mistakes." Jonah stood at the rail, motionless except for his hands twisting the hem of his t-shirt. "He chose us," the boy said, quiet but anchored. "You saw it." Ethan kept his eyes on the panel he was tightening. The wrench bit his palm, a small, honest pain. "Horses don't choose, son. They survive." "Maybe both can be true," Lila said. She set a small jar on the rail, ointment the color of wet clay. "I'm not asking you to keep him. Forever. I'm asking you for 72 hours. Let me try what I know. Let him try too." 72 hours. Ethan could hold his breath that long. He could hold a line that long. He could even hold the past at arm's length for that long, if the night didn't get clever. "Fine," he said. "But if he smashes a panel or hurts himself or you, he goes. I won't bury another mistake." Lila nodded. She understood the word another carried more weight than everything else combined. They worked in the heat-bleached light until dusk bled into cobalt. Jonah hauled water by the bucket when the hose sputtered. Ethan found a stack of cedar posts at the back of the barn and drove them into reluctant ground, the mallet ringing like a bell that called no one to supper. Lila mixed the ointment with patience and something like reverence, the way certain nurses dress wounds for people they will never meet again, but will always remember. When the first stars flared open, the stallion tested the fence. Not by charging, not by panic. He drifted to each corner and pressed a shoulder lightly to the panel, listening for the story in the metal. Ethan stepped where the stallion could see him. "Not tonight," he said in a firefighter's command tone that left no room for fire. The stallion turned an ear. The panel held. A pickup rolled past, slow, engine low. Old Mr. Chavez raised 2 fingers above his steering wheel in a salute that was 50% welcome and 50% warning. Beyond him the town glowed faintly. The gas station sign blinking, a diner window lit like a warm square stitched to the dark. Somewhere a radio played an old country song in a key that had learned to forgive. "Eat," Jonah whispered, setting out a flake of hay that looked too small against the big square of the horse. The stallion nosed it, exhaled, and stood with the kind of stillness that made time notice itself. "Some won't touch hay the first night," Lila said. "Too many new ghosts in the air." Ghosts. The word slid under Ethan's ribs and found a familiar seat. He looked at the corral and saw, only for an instant, Caleb at 16. Legs too long for his horse, hat too big for his head, laughing like the sun had been made for him. He saw the long smoke of a ridge fire and heard the pop of piñon cones as they surrendered to heat. He blinked, and the corral returned, the stallion replacing the mirage, the scar catching starlight now. "Tell me his name," Jonah said. "We can't keep calling him Phantom. That's the town's name. We need our own." "He doesn't belong to us," Ethan said, automatic as a gate latch. "Maybe not yet," Jonah replied. A small shape in the dark, a boy trying on belief the way some boys try on baseball caps. "But if he stays, he should have something ours." Ethan set the mallet down and leaned on the top rail. He listened to the dry rattle of insects, the whisper of cottonwood leaves, the far-off groan of a semi working through gears on the highway, commerce moving across the night, people buying and selling lives they hoped might finally balance. He thought of lines he'd sign and lines he wouldn't. He thought of the kind of home insurance you can't buy, the kind where the house is the one inside your chest and the policy is written in who you keep and who keeps you. "Names come when they're ready," he said. It sounded like a dodge, and maybe it was, but it also felt true. They stayed a long while, the three of them strung along the fence like beads on a thin cord, boy, man, Mustang. The desert cooled. A coyote called somewhere beyond the wash, a sound like a question left on a doorstep. Lila checked the stallion one last time, capped the jar, and pressed it into Jonah's hands. "Morning and evening," she said. "Just enough to shine the skin, not smother it." "What about me?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. "What do I do?" Lila considered him in the thin light. "You breathe," she said. "And you don't lie to him. Horses hate lies." He almost smiled. "So do people." "Not as much as they say." She lifted a small wave, then headed for her SUV. "I'll be back at sunup." By the time her taillights vanished down the road, the stars had multiplied. Jonah leaned his head on the rail, the boy's day finally catching up to his bones. Ethan touched his shoulder. "Bed," he said. "I'm not sleepy," Jonah murmured, already falling. Ethan nudged him toward the porch. The screen door sighed, the house receiving them with the familiarity of a long marriage. No romance, but a deep agreement that the night would be shared. Ethan poured water into a glass and set it beside Jonah's bed, then stood by the window and watched the square of corral light where the stallion shifted once and then stood, a silhouette cut out of the dark. He could call the Colorado sanctuary tonight. He could box this story, tape it shut, label it with something dignified, like best outcome. He could choose what was safe for his bank account, his fences, his sleep. But the image kept returning. The deliberate bend of a knee on barn dirt, the way the stallion had looked across a room full of people and found one man who had not been chosen for anything in a very long time. Outside, the wind lifted, then settled. The house cooled around him. Ethan reached to turn off the lamp and saw, on the chair by the door, Jonah's harmonica glinting faintly. A cheap thing, tinny and earnest, the kind of music a boy carries like a secret. He picked it up, felt its small weight, and set it beside the empty glass. 72 hours, he said to the quiet. We'll give him that. In the corral, the stallion's ears tipped toward the house as if he'd heard. He shifted, breathed, and went still again, a statue warming from the inside. The night arranged itself around man and boy and horse, and somewhere beyond the cottonwood, the desert composed its patient lullaby. By the time Ethan lay down, the harmonica had slipped into Jonah's palm. Even in sleep, the boy curled around it, as if it were a promise he wouldn't let go. And out across the yard, the stallion lifted his head toward the window's pale square. Not curious, not wary, simply listening, as if the dark itself were humming a tune he almost recognized. The desert night carried a strange hush, a stillness that pressed against the walls of the Walker house, as if listening for breath inside. Crickets sang, coyotes called from the far ridge, and somewhere the cottonwood by the well rustled like pages turning in a book no one had read in years. In the corral, the stallion stood steady under starlight, a copper shadow outlined in silver. His ears twitched, catching sounds too faint for human notice, and yet his gaze lingered on the dim square of Jonah's window. Inside, Jonah lay restless, his harmonica clutched tight. Sleep came and went in waves, shallow and unsettled. He had dreamed of the auction again, of the horse's dark eyes fixed on his father. In the dream, the horse had spoken without words, and Jonah had understood. He couldn't recall the message now, only the echo it left, an ache that demanded sound. He slipped from bed, bare feet quiet on the floorboards, and padded outside with the harmonica in hand. The screen door sighed, but didn't betray him. The desert air wrapped him in cool breath, carrying the faint smell of dust and sage. Jonah climbed onto the lowest rail of the corral and sat cross-legged, harmonica pressed to his lips. The first notes were soft, uncertain, a wandering tune, halting like a child learning to walk. But as his breath found rhythm, the melody took shape. A lullaby Caleb once played on his battered guitar, a tune Jonah only knew because Ethan had hummed it absent-mindedly years ago. The sound carried across the corral, thin and human, fragile enough to break if the wind leaned too hard. The stallion lifted his head. He did not shy from the boy. He did not turn away. Instead, he stepped closer, each hoof landing with the quiet gravity of choice. His breath puffed in small clouds, catching moonlight like smoke. Jonah froze, fingers trembling against the harmonica. He kept playing, each note trembling but true. The horse stopped within arm's reach, ears pricked forward. His scarred neck glistened faintly where ointment had eased the rope burn. Jonah lowered the harmonica, the last note hanging in the air like a held secret. For a long moment, the boy and the stallion simply breathed together. Then, slowly, Jonah stretched out a hand. "Easy," he whispered, voice shaking. "You're safe." The stallion's nostrils flared, hot breath brushing across Jonah's skin. Jonah kept still, his palm open, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The horse lowered his head, eyes dark and fathomless, and pressed his muzzle to the boy's hand. Jonah let out a sound, halfway between a laugh and a sob. He wanted to call for his father, to shout that the horse trusted him, but he didn't. This moment felt too fragile, too private, like a prayer whispered into stone. Behind him, the house remained dark. Ethan sat awake by the window, a coffee gone cold at his elbow. He had heard the faint strains of the harmonica, had watched Jonah sneak outside, but he hadn't stopped him. Something told him this was not his moment to claim. Through the glass, he saw the boy's small figure and the horse's bowed head. He pressed a hand to his chest, where an old grief stirred, sharp as a blade and tender as mercy. Lila arrived just before dawn, her headlights cutting pale circles across the yard. She stepped out quietly, careful not to break whatever spell lingered in the air. Jonah had dozed off against the fence, harmonica still in hand, the stallion standing guard beside him like an ancient sentinel. Ethan came out of the house, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes shadowed. He lifted Jonah into his arms, the boy stirring but not waking. "He played for him," Ethan murmured, voice low. "And the horse listened." Lila smiled faintly, though her gaze remained on the stallion. "Horses don't lie," she said. "If he chose to stand by your boy all night, then there's more to him than fear or fight. That's a bond, Ethan. You can't buy that at any auction." Ethan shook his head, unwilling to surrender so quickly. "It's one night. That doesn't mean it'll last." But as he carried Jonah inside, the stallion followed them along the fence line, step for step, as if to argue otherwise. When Ethan laid his son in bed, Jonah's fingers still curled around the harmonica, refusing to let go even in dreams. Back outside, the desert was waking. The sky blushed pink, and the air filled with the faint, sweet smell of creosote after dew. The stallion stood where the corral opened east, head lifted toward the sunrise. Ethan joined him at the rail, his hands rough against the wood. "You keep looking at me like you know something," Ethan said quietly. "But I don't have answers for you. I barely have them for him." The stallion turned his head, ears flicking, eyes locking once more with Ethan's. For a heartbeat, Ethan saw Caleb again, his brother's grin, his reckless certainty, the way he never turned back once he chose a path. Ethan closed his eyes, shook the image away, and stepped back from the fence. But the words still lingered, words he hadn't spoken since the fire. "I should have saved you." The wind rose, carrying the faint echo of the harmonica, though no one played it now. The desert seemed to breathe, patient and eternal, waiting to see whether Ethan Walker would finally stop running from what had already found him. The morning sun rose sharp over the mesas, burning the desert clean with its light. Ethan Walker stepped onto the porch, mug of coffee in hand, his body heavy with a sleepless night. He had watched Jonah play for the horse, had seen the impossible calm that followed, and he hadn't found rest since. Now the boy lay tangled in his blankets, harmonica clutched to his chest like a talisman, while the stallion stood in the corral as if he had been carved out of bronze. The air smelled of creosote and dust. From the barn came the faint rustle of hay mice. Ethan lowered himself into the old rocker, its wood groaning under his weight. He had planned to fix fence posts today, maybe replace shingles on the barn roof, but instead he stared at the horse until the coffee went cold. Every tilt of the stallion's head reminded him of Caleb, of how his brother had once leaned in a saddle, loose and fearless, scanning the horizon for trouble that would inevitably find him. By mid-morning, Jonah wandered outside, rubbing sleep from his eyes, hair sticking up at odd angles. "He's still here," the boy said, more a statement than surprise. "Where else would he go?" Ethan asked, though the question carried more meaning than he admitted. Jonah walked to the corral, harmonica dangling from his fingers. The stallion watched him approach and stepped forward, closing the distance like a shadow drawn toward flame. Jonah smiled, shy but sure. "Morning, Ashfire," he said. Ethan stiffened. "Don't name him." "He needs a name," Jonah replied, without turning around. "Everyone does." Ethan wanted to argue, but the word caught in his throat. Ashfire. The sound of it stirred the old memory of smoke rolling across the ridge, of orange skies that swallowed voices whole. He swallowed hard, looked away, and told himself it was just a boy's imagination. Nothing more. Later that day, while cleaning out the barn, Ethan stumbled on a wooden crate buried under tarps and rusted tools. He dragged it into the light and pried the lid open with a crowbar. Inside lay remnants of another time, a cracked saddle horn, a pair of gloves worn down to threads, and at the very bottom, a charred leather pouch. Ethan lifted it slowly, heart stuttering. He had seen it before. Once, in Caleb's hands on the night before the fire. The pouch still carried the faint smell of smoke. Inside was a compass, its glass cracked, the needle trembling as if caught between directions. On the back were initials burned deep into the leather. C.W. Caleb Walker. Ethan's breath left him in a rush. He leaned against the workbench, chest tight. For 30 years he had told himself that nothing of Caleb remained, that the fire had consumed everything. Yet here was proof that part of his brother had endured, waiting in silence for Ethan to find it. Jonah appeared in the doorway, sunlight spilling around him. "Dad?" Ethan turned sharply, hiding the pouch behind his back. "What are you doing here?" "I heard something," Jonah said. "Like wood breaking." "What is it?" His eyes narrowed, curious. "Nothing you need to worry about," Ethan replied too quickly. He shoved the pouch back into the crate and dropped the lid. Dust rose between them like a veil. Jonah studied his father for a long moment, then looked past him to the stallion standing motionless in the corral. "He knows," the boy said quietly. "The horse. He knows what you're hiding." That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. He tiptoed to the barn with a flashlight, searching for the crate his father had tried to bury again. He pried the lid open and pulled out the pouch, his fingers trembling as he traced the burned initials. The compass needle quivered wildly, then stilled, pointing east toward Mesa Ridge. Jonah felt the air grow colder, though the night was warm. The stallion stirred, stepping closer to the fence, as if summoned by the discovery. Jonah lifted the compass, and the horse's eyes caught the weak beam of light, reflecting something more than animal instinct. The boy whispered, "You belonged to him, didn't you? My uncle." The stallion blew out a long breath, a sound not quite a sigh, not quite a snort. Jonah shivered. He tucked the pouch under his shirt and ran back toward the house, not knowing whether he carried a gift or a burden. In his room, under the pale glow of the moon, Jonah opened the compass again. The needle quivered, then fixed once more on Mesa Ridge. He didn't understand why, but he knew one thing. The horse wasn't just a stranger dragged from the desert. He was a message, a reminder, maybe even a path. Across the hall, Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, staring into the dark. He could still feel the weight of the pouch in his hand, smell the smoke that had lingered all these years. He whispered Caleb's name once, softly, and the sound nearly broke him. Outside, the stallion raised his head, ears pricked as if he had heard. The desert was waking old secrets, and Ethan Walker was running out of places to hide. The morning after Jonah found the compass, the desert air carried a strange sharpness, as if the land itself had turned to listen. Ethan walked the fence line with a coil of wire and pliers, his hands moving out of habit while his mind churned. Every so often he glanced toward the barn where Jonah lingered, the boy's shoulders hunched in the doorway, as though guarding a secret. The stallion stood near him, silent and steady, ears tipped east. Always east, toward Mesa Ridge. By mid-morning, the heat had risen enough to warp the horizon. Lila arrived in her SUV, dust trailing behind like smoke from an old fire. She brought a box of supplies, bandages, salves, a bag of oats, and her usual calm. "How's he holding?" she asked, nodding toward the stallion. "Better than us," Ethan muttered. He didn't mean for the words to carry weight, but they did. Lila tilted her head, studying him. Jonah interrupted before either could press further. He pulled the compass from his pocket, the cracked glass catching the light. "Look," he said, his voice a mix of awe and fear. "It only points one way, always east, toward Mesa Ridge." Lila frowned, reaching for it, but Jonah held it back against his chest. "My uncle's initials are on it," he whispered. "It's his. And Ashfire. He reacts when I open it." The horse tossed his head as if on cue, the long scar along his neck, glinting. Lila narrowed her eyes. "Animals remember places," she said softly. "Sometimes better than we do. Maybe he came from there, maybe he's leading you back." Ethan shook his head hard, a denial sharp enough to cut the air. "We're not going chasing ghosts. That ridge burned 30 years ago. Nothing left but rock and ash." "Not nothing," Jonah said quietly. "Him." The words landed like stones. Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, the wind shifted. A dry gust swept across the yard, rattling the cottonwood leaves and carrying with it the faint, acrid smell of old smoke. Ethan froze. For an instant the air felt heavy with memory, as if the ridge fire still smoldered unseen beyond the horizon. That night, Ethan sat alone on the porch, bourbon untouched beside him. He listened to Jonah's breathing through the open window. Steady and deep, the compass hidden under the boy's pillow. The stallion stood at the far corner of the corral, head lifted toward Mesa Ridge, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Ethan gripped the armrest of the rocker until his knuckles whitened. The desert whispered, and he hated how much it sounded like Caleb's voice. 2 days later, Lila returned with maps. She spread them across the kitchen table, tracing a finger over ridges and washes. "There's an old service trail that skirts the canyon," she said. "It's rough, but passable. I want to take him there. See what he remembers." "You're out of your mind," Ethan snapped. "That horse isn't leading us to anything but broken bones." But Jonah was already leaning over the map, eyes wide. "If it's where Uncle disappeared, don't you want to know? Don't you want to see for yourself?" The silence that followed was long and thick. Ethan felt the old guilt stirring, the weight of 30 years pressing against his chest. He wanted to say no, to end the conversation, but he couldn't. Instead, he heard himself ask, "And what if the desert takes more than it gives back?" Jonah met his gaze without flinching. "Then at least we tried." That evening, when the sun sank blood-red behind the mesas, Ethan stood by the corral, the compass heavy in his palm. The stallion approached, eyes locking onto his as if he'd been waiting. For a moment, Ethan let the possibility in, the thought that his brother had left something behind, something alive. He whispered Caleb's name once into the cooling air. The stallion flicked an ear, exhaled, and turned toward the east again. Ethan closed his eyes. The word caught in his throat. The desert was calling. And though he swore they would not answer, deep down he knew. The choice was already made. The road to Mesa Ridge was more suggestion than path, a scar of dirt winding through sagebrush and brittle grass, carved decades ago by ranchers who had long since given up the land. Ethan's truck rattled over ruts, each bump shaking bolts loose, the sound of metal complaining louder than the engine. Behind him, a trailer carried the stallion, silent, steady, eyes fixed on the horizon, as though he knew exactly where they were headed. Jonah sat in the passenger seat, compass clutched in his hand. The needle quivered faintly with each turn, but always it settled back east, a restless insistence that gnawed at Ethan's nerves. Lila followed in her SUV, dust pluming behind her like smoke, her determination as steady as the desert sun. By late afternoon, the ridge rose ahead, its sandstone cliffs glowing the color of old embers. The wind shifted, carrying with it a smell that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Char, faint but unmistakable, like the ghost of a fire that should have died 30 years ago. He tightened his grip on the wheel, jaw clenched. They stopped where the trail ended. The land dropped away in a sharp cliff, the canyon below yawning wide and silent. Not even birds wheeled overhead. The stillness unnerved Jonah, who pressed closer to his father as they stepped out. "It feels like the world's holding its breath," the boy whispered. Ethan didn't answer. He could hardly breathe himself. His boots crunched over the red dirt as he walked to the edge. The memory struck like lightning. The last time he stood here, smoke boiling up from the canyon, Caleb's voice shouting over the wind, "I'll circle down! Meet you on the other side!" That was the last he heard. After that, only fire. He gripped the compass, the cracked glass digging into his palm. The needle pointed straight across the canyon. His chest tightened. "It's madness," he muttered. "Nothing out there but stone and ghosts." Jonah stood beside him, face pale, but eyes alight. "Then why does it feel like he's waiting?" He nodded toward the stallion. The horse had walked to the cliff's edge, hooves firm, ears forward. He stared across the canyon with the patience of someone remembering a road others had forgotten. Lila joined them, her voice soft. "Sometimes animals carry memory the way land carries water. It hides, but it doesn't disappear." Ethan's throat worked, words stuck. He wanted to turn back, to load the horse, to bury the compass in the desert, and never come near this ridge again. But the silence pressed against him, thick and demanding. It was not an emptiness. It was a presence. The stallion lowered his head and pawed the ground. Dust lifted in small spirals. Jonah crouched, brushing away loose earth where the horse had scraped. His fingers closed on something cold. He pulled it free and held it up. A brass button, blackened but intact. The initials C. Faint, but visible. Ethan staggered back, breath stolen, his knees nearly buckled. "No," he whispered. His brother's uniform had carried those buttons. He remembered them shining in sunlight, Caleb laughing, flicking one with a finger like it was a lucky charm. Jonah placed the button in his father's hand. He was here. The words sliced through Ethan's defenses. His vision blurred. He saw Caleb's face again. Not in smoke this time, but in sunlight, grinning at him from across the canyon as if waiting to be called home. He pressed the button to his chest and let out a sound that was half sob, half prayer. The stallion exhaled, a low rumble that vibrated through the earth. Then he did something that froze them all. He bent one knee and lowered himself again, bowing not to the canyon, but to Ethan. The silence of Mesa Ridge deepened, echoing around them like a cathedral. For a moment, time folded. The canyon was not empty. It was full of memory, full of presence. Ethan sank to his knees in the dust, the button clenched in his fist, his breath ragged. Jonah touched his shoulder, anchoring him. Lila said nothing. She knew some wounds needed no witness but the land itself. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long across the ridge. The stallion rose, shook his mane, and turned his head back toward the trail, as if to say, "This is not the end, only the beginning." Ethan stood slowly, wiping his face with a rough hand. He tucked the button into his pocket, heavier than any stone. The desert had spoken, and though he wished to deny it, he knew. Caleb's story was not finished, and neither was his. They began the long walk back to the truck, silence between them, each carrying something unseen. Behind them, the cliff stood quiet, holding its secret the way the desert always did. Patient, eternal, waiting. Night folded itself around San Isidro with the weight of a quilt stitched from silence. The town slept, but at the Walker Ranch, the lights glowed late. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, Caleb's button in front of him, its brass dull under the lamp. He turned it over in his fingers again and again, the grooves cutting into his skin. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the canyon, the stillness, the stallion lowering his knee as if in reverence. Jonah leaned against the doorframe, hair messy from the long drive back, compass clutched in his palm. He had said little since they left Mesa Ridge, but his eyes told stories his mouth couldn't. At last, he whispered, "He was there, Dad. You know he was." Ethan looked up sharply, pain flashing in his eyes. "We don't know anything. A button in the dirt doesn't prove—" His voice broke. He swallowed hard and tried again. "It doesn't prove he survived." Jonah crossed the room and set the compass next to the button. The cracked glass reflected both their faces in fragments. "Maybe not. But something does. You felt it. Same as I did." The wind rose outside, rattling the windows. For a moment it sounded like a voice calling from far across the desert. Ethan clenched his fists against the table. "Feelings don't bring a man back," he said hoarsely. But he didn't believe his own words. Later, Jonah crept into the barn, flashlight beam slicing through the dark. Ashfire stood waiting, muscles gleaming in the pale light, his eyes catching the beam and holding it like lanterns. Jonah sat cross-legged in the straw and opened the compass again. The needle quivered, then stilled east, stubborn as truth. He began to read aloud from Caleb's old field notes, entries he had found tucked inside the charred pouch. His voice shook, but he kept reading. Dates, sketches of terrain, small jokes scribbled in margins. Ashfire's ears flicked, nostrils flaring as if the words stirred memory. When Jonah paused, the horse stepped closer, lowering his head until his breath stirred the pages. "You remember him," Jonah whispered. "Don't you?" A low exhale answered, almost human in its steadiness. Jonah's chest tightened. For the first time, he felt not just comfort but responsibility, as though the desert itself had placed a charge in his hands. Outside, Ethan stood in the shadows, unseen. He had followed Jonah, ready to scold, ready to drag him back to bed. But the sight stopped him cold. His son reading Caleb's words into the dark, and the Mustang listening with a patience no ordinary horse could hold. Something inside Ethan cracked. His knees went weak, and he pressed a hand to the barn wall for balance. For 30 years, he had buried Caleb in silence, afraid to speak his name aloud because the pain was too sharp. But now, through Jonah's trembling voice and the horse's steady presence, he felt his brother near in a way he had not dared hope. The wind pressed harder against the barn, whistling through loose boards. Ethan closed his eyes, and in the hollow of the sound, he heard it, faint, fleeting, but unmistakable. Caleb's voice, carried by air and memory. "You left me once. Don't leave me again." Ethan's breath hitched. He wanted to call out, but fear sealed his throat. He turned, retreating into the night, his boots crunching gravel louder than they should have. Back on the porch, he sat heavily, burying his face in his hands. The button lay in his pocket like a stone, heavier with every beat of his heart. When dawn came, the desert smelled of wet earth, though no rain had fallen. Jonah emerged from the barn with straw in his hair and a new steadiness in his step. He held the compass tight, its needle quivering toward Mesa Ridge. Ashfire followed him along the fence, hooves silent, gaze unbroken. Ethan watched from the porch, hollowed and raw. He knew now that silence would no longer shield him. The desert was speaking. Caleb was speaking. And the words in the wind demanded an answer. That night, the Walker Ranch fell under a silence so complete it unsettled even the crickets. The air hung heavy, as if the desert itself held its breath. The cottonwood by the well did not stir, and the stars burned sharp and cold above, crowding the sky with their watchful eyes. Ethan sat on the porch, shoulders bent, Caleb's button turning endlessly in his fingers. Every scrape of brass against calloused skin deepened the ache in his chest. Inside, Jonah slept in fitful bursts, the compass tucked beneath his pillow. His face looked younger in sleep, unburdened, but even then his fingers twitched as if he held on to the unseen. Ethan envied him. The boy carried hope like a torch, while Ethan carried only ash. The barn creaked in the distance. Ashfire shifted, hooves muffled against straw, but did not pace. Instead, he stood like a sentinel, head angled toward the ridge far beyond the horizon. Ethan knew without looking that the horse would hold that vigil until dawn. Around midnight, the wind returned. It came slow, curling through the yard like smoke, raising dust but not sound. Ethan stiffened. In the sigh of that wind, he thought he heard his name. Not shouted, not imagined. Spoken. Low and steady, Caleb's voice as it had been 30 years ago. Ethan. The coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the porch boards. He rose to his feet, pulse pounding, scanning the darkness. But there was no one. Only shadows stitched between barn and corral. Ashfire lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes catching starlight. He exhaled long and slow, the sound eerily human. Ethan gripped the porch rail until his knuckles whitened. "What do you want from me?" he rasped into the dark. The wind answered with another hollow murmur, carrying no words this time, only a weight that pressed against his chest. He turned away, stumbling inside like a man escaping a fire he could not fight. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. Memories swarmed, Caleb laughing as they raced horses down a dry wash, Caleb's stubborn refusal to retreat from the blaze, the last glimpse of him swallowed by smoke. Guilt pressed against Ethan like heat in his lungs. He whispered into the quiet, "I should have stopped you. I should have gone with you." When sleep finally came, it was no mercy. He dreamed of the canyon again, but different this time. The smoke cleared, and on the opposite rim stood Caleb. Not in uniform, not burned, but whole. Beside him was Ashfire, scar still bright, but eyes younger, clearer. Caleb raised a hand as if to wave him across, but when Ethan stepped forward, the ground crumbled. He woke with a strangled gasp, sweat cold on his skin. Before dawn, Jonah crept outside once more. Ethan followed quietly, unable to rest. He watched from the shadows as Jonah leaned against the corral, harmonica in hand. The boy did not play, only held it close, whispering words Ethan couldn't hear. Ashfire stood near, muzzle brushing the rail, ears tilted toward the boy as though listening. The first thin light of morning spilled across the desert, painting the land in gray and silver. Jonah finally looked up and saw his father in the gloom. "He's not just here for me," the boy said softly. "He's here for you, too." Ethan felt something break open inside him, raw and unsteady. He stepped forward, laying a hand on the fence. The wood was rough beneath his palm, grounding him. Ashfire lifted his head and met his eyes. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought he saw not just the horse, but Caleb's steady gaze looking back, urging him to let go, to listen. The desert grew still again, but this stillness was not empty. It was expectant, as if the land itself waited for Ethan's answer. He didn't give one, not yet. Instead, he whispered into the dawn, "I hear you." Ashfire snorted once, a soft sound that drifted into the morning like an agreement. The following day dawned with a brittle clarity, the kind of light that showed every flaw in the land. The cracked earth, the leaning fences, the thin cattle drifting like shadows across the range. Ethan rose early, though sleep had not claimed him for long. His body carried the weight of restless dreams, but his hands found work, because work was the only shield he trusted. He mended the trough, hammered nails into the warped boards of the barn, anything to keep from meeting the eyes that seemed to follow him everywhere. Ashfire's, Jonah's, and the memory of Caleb's. By mid-morning, a low hum rippled through town. Word had spread about the stallion kneeling again at Mesa Ridge. Folks from San Isidro drove out, parking along the road and gathering at the Walker fence. Their voices buzzed like locusts, carrying awe, doubt, envy. Some muttered that the horse was cursed. Others whispered that he was blessed. Ethan felt the scrutiny burning across his yard like a second sun. He hated it, the way the town always turned tragedy into spectacle. He tightened his grip on the post he was repairing until splinters bit his palm. "We're not a sideshow," he growled under his breath. Jonah, though, stood at the corral without fear. He faced the cluster of neighbors with his chin lifted, a boy standing taller than his years. Ashfire drifted to his side, Scar catching the light, and the crowd grew hushed. Jonah rested his small hand against the stallion's neck and said simply, "He belongs with us now." The silence that followed was deeper than any sermon. Men removed their hats without knowing why. Women pressed hands to their chests. And slowly, as if some unspoken truth had been acknowledged, the crowd began to thin. Trucks rumbled away, leaving dust that settled gently back to the earth. Ethan watched from the porch, torn between pride and dread. His son had spoken with the kind of conviction Ethan had not felt in years, and the land seemed to respond. For when the last engine faded, the desert itself grew still, as if pausing to listen. That evening, the stillness deepened. The air carried no bird song, no coyote cries. Even the insects seemed muted. Their chorus hushed. Jonah sat cross-legged in the dirt with his harmonica, but he did not play. Instead, he hummed softly, the tune winding low and tender. Ashfire lowered his head until their foreheads nearly touched, the boy's hum threading into the horse's slow, steady breath. Ethan stood a few paces away, the silence pressing on him. He could feel it in his bones, that the desert was holding something beneath its surface, waiting for release. He thought of old tales Caleb used to repeat around campfires, how the land remembered, how voices carried in stone. He had laughed them off then, calling them superstition. Now he wasn't so sure. As night fell, the sky unfolded into a sheet of stars, brilliant and countless. The wind picked up, faint at first, then stronger, weaving through the grass with a rhythm that sounded almost like music. It rose and fell, carrying a low hum that blended with Jonah's tune until it was impossible to tell where the boy's voice ended and the desert began. Lila arrived just in time to hear it. She stopped by the gate, arms folded against the chill. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly, though his throat had gone dry. The wind seemed to shape words he could not quite catch, syllables dissolving before they formed. Still, the sound burrowed deep, filling the spaces grief had carved hollow. Jonah looked up, his face glowing in the starlight. "It's him," he said simply. "Uncle Caleb. He's singing through the land." The words struck Ethan like a hammer. He wanted to deny them, to insist it was only wind, only coincidence, but the ache in his chest told him otherwise. He closed his eyes, listening harder. For the briefest moment, he heard it clearly. Caleb's laugh folded into the sound, the same bright note that once rang across ridges and rivers. When the wind finally died, the silence left behind was not empty, but full. Charged. Expectant. Ashfire lifted his head, eyes locking onto Ethan's. It was not challenge in that gaze, nor command. It was invitation. Ethan stepped closer to the fence, his breath shallow. He rested a hand on the rail and whispered into the night, "If you're still here, then show me how to carry you." The stallion flicked an ear, exhaled, and pressed closer to Jonah. The boy smiled, weary but content. "He already has," Jonah said softly. Ethan looked at his son, at the horse, at the wide desert sky that seemed suddenly alive. For the first time in decades, he felt the faintest shift inside him, a loosening of the knot he had carried since the fire. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not even peace, but it was the beginning of both. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment the horizon shimmered under a still heat, the next it split with jagged light. Clouds boiled over the mesas, black and tumbling, their bellies lit by sudden streaks of fire across the sky. The Walker Ranch braced beneath the weight of it, every nail and timber groaning as if the house itself remembered the old blaze that had once stolen so much. Ethan rushed to the corral as the wind howled. Dust whirled into his eyes, and the smell of electricity stung his nose. Ashfire reared, muscles straining against the storm, ears pinned flat in terror. His scar seemed to glow in each flash of lightning. Jonah ran to the fence, shouting, "He's going to break through!" Ethan caught him by the shoulders. "Stay back!" But Jonah tore free, climbing through the rails before Ethan could stop him. The boy ran straight into the corral, harmonica clutched like a weapon. "Jonah!" Ethan's voice was ripped away by the storm. He stumbled forward, boots sinking in mud churned by sudden rain. Lightning split the sky, throwing the world into stark white. He saw his son standing in front of the terrified stallion, tiny against the bulk of the horse and the violence of the storm. Ashfire's eyes rolled white, hooves striking the ground like war drums. Jonah lifted the harmonica and blew a trembling note. The sound was thin, almost lost in the roar of thunder. But it was there, fragile, persistent, a thread of humanity against chaos. Ethan reached the corral gate and froze. The horse had stilled. The boy's tune wavered, faltered, then steadied. Ashfire lowered his head, breath heaving, scar glistening with rain. He stepped closer, not in rage but in surrender. The storm raged, but inside that small square of earth, something shifted. Ethan climbed the rail, dropping into the mud. "Jonah!" he shouted, pushing forward. His son turned, eyes bright with terror and triumph. "He's listening, Dad! He's listening!" Ashfire's ears flicked toward Ethan. The horse exhaled a long, deep breath, then pressed his muzzle against Jonah's chest. The boy's small hand rose to the scar, fingers trembling. Lightning cracked above them, but Jonah didn't flinch. "He's not afraid," Jonah whispered. "Not anymore." Ethan felt his knees weaken, the weight of the moment pressing into him harder than the storm itself. He stepped closer, rain soaking his shirt, mud clinging to his boots. He laid a hand on his son's shoulder. Then, hesitant, almost unwilling, he reached toward the stallion's neck. For the first time, Ashfire allowed his touch. The horse's skin was hot under his palm, muscles taut but steady. A shiver ran through Ethan, a spark that felt like memory itself passing into him. He closed his eyes, and for an instant he was no longer standing in the storm. He was back on the ridge 30 years ago, Caleb's hand gripping his arm, Caleb's voice shouting over the roar, "We'll make it, brother, just hold the line!" The vision shattered with the next thunderclap. Ethan staggered back, gasping, heart hammering. Jonah caught his sleeve. "You felt it too," the boy said, breathless but certain. "You can't pretend anymore." The rain eased as quickly as it had come. The storm broke, leaving only the hiss of water running through dry washes. The sky opened in tatters of cloud, stars blinking back into view. The ranch lay drenched, steaming, transformed. Ashfire stood between father and son, head high, chest heaving, but no longer wild with fear. He shook himself, water spraying in arcs, then nudged Jonah forward as if guiding him back to safety. Ethan followed in silence, his mind burning hotter than the storm had. Later, when the boy was asleep, Ethan sat alone by the barn. The smell of wet earth mingled with the faint scent of smoke, a cruel reminder. He pressed the brass button into his palm, feeling its edges cut. "I tried, Caleb," he whispered into the dark. "God knows I tried, but maybe I didn't try hard enough." The desert answered with silence. Only Ashfire moved, stepping from the corral to stand beside him. The horse lowered his head, brushing Ethan's shoulder with a weight that was both comfort and burden. Ethan bowed his head, tears hot on his cheeks, and let them fall for the first time in years. The land smelled of iron and wet stone in the days after the storm, as if the desert had been washed clean of dust, but not of memory. Ethan moved through chores with a strange calm, as though something inside him had broken open during the lightning's fury. He had touched Ashfire's skin, felt the heat and the pulse beneath, and in that heartbeat he had known. The horse carried more than muscle and bone. He carried the past, and maybe even the brother Ethan had lost. Jonah sensed the change, too. The boy's eyes carried less pleading and more certainty now, as if the storm had sealed a promise between him and the Mustang. He followed Ashfire like a shadow, brushing him down, humming tunes in the barn, never once questioned or resisted. Ashfire accepted him, stood for him, moved with him. With Ethan, the horse was cautious, but not hostile. Watching. Waiting. On the third day, Jonah found Ethan by the porch with maps spread across the table. "We need to go back," the boy said without preamble. His fingers hovered over Mesa Ridge, the canyon carved in sharp lines of ink. "He's been pointing there all along." Ethan rubbed his temples. The thought had gnawed at him since the storm. He had dreamed of Caleb again, this time standing at the ridge edge, silent, the wind carrying words Ethan could not quite hear. "It's not safe," he muttered. "The trail's worse now, washed out. And what if there's nothing there?" Jonah's voice hardened. "What if there is?" He set the compass on the map. The cracked glass glinted, the needle trembling but always dragging east. Ashfire stamped outside, as though echoing the argument. Lila joined them that evening, her bag slung over her shoulder, dust on her boots. "He needs to go back," she said, no hesitation. "You can't keep him penned here. He remembers something out there, and until you follow, none of you will rest." Ethan looked at her, then at Jonah, then at the horse standing in the dying light. Ashfire's scar glowed faintly as the sun sank behind the mesas. Against his will, Ethan felt the truth press in. He had avoided the ridge for 30 years. Perhaps it was time to face it. The next morning, they loaded supplies: water, rope, a lantern, Jonah's harmonica. Ethan saddled the old truck with weight it had not carried in years. Ashfire did not resist when led from the corral. He walked with the same solemn stride he had shown at the auction, the stride of something that chose its steps not for speed, but for meaning. The road was harsher this time, rutted from the storm, the canyon edges gleaming wet. Dust clung to their throats, though clouds still hung heavy above. When they reached the trailhead, Ethan stopped the truck and stared long at the ridge. His breath came tight, but he nodded once. "We ride the rest of the way," he said. Jonah's face lit, though fear flickered too. "Together?" Ethan met his eyes. Together. For the first time in decades, Ethan swung into a saddle. Ashfire shifted beneath him, but did not resist. The stallion's gait was steady, almost familiar, as though guided by muscle memory Ethan did not own. Jonah walked beside, compass in his palm, guiding them along a trail nearly lost to time. Lila followed close, her presence quiet, but grounding. The ridge rose before them, silent as a grave, but no longer hostile. The canyon spread wide, red stone walls scarred with old black streaks. Ethan dismounted at the edge, knees weak, his hand finding the button in his pocket. He pressed it to the ground, whispering, "I'm here, Caleb. I should have been here all along." The wind stirred, rising sudden, circling them with a hollow sound that seemed almost like words. Ashfire stepped forward, scraping at the dirt with one hoof. Jonah dropped to his knees, brushing aside loose earth. His fingers struck something solid, leather, cracked and half-buried. He pulled free a fragment of saddle strap, initials burned faintly into it. C.W. Ethan staggered, tears rising unbidden. He touched the strap with trembling hands, the smell of charred hide filling his senses. The ridge was no longer just stone. It was a grave and a shrine, a place where something had ended and something else had waited 30 years to begin again. Ashfire bent his head, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan clutched the strap tight, his voice breaking. "You stayed," he whispered. "God help me. You stayed." The canyon gave no answer, but the silence was not empty. It was thick, alive, holding them all in its grasp. Ethan bowed his head, Jonah's small hand gripping his arm, and for the first time since the fire, he let himself weep without shame. When they rose, the light had changed. The desert glowed gold, the kind of light that feels like forgiveness. Ashfire lifted his head and looked east again, deeper into the canyon, as if there was more yet to find. Ethan wiped his face, steadied his breath, and nodded. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the last part of the beginning." Ashfire snorted once, as though in agreement. And together, man, boy, woman, and horse took their first steps deeper into the canyon's silence. The canyon opened into a place that seemed untouched by time. Red walls curved high above, their faces streaked with black from the fire decades ago, yet the floor of the gorge was green with new shoots and dotted with wildflowers that had no right to be there. Jonah gasped, the sound echoing against the stone. "It's alive," he whispered. Ethan dismounted, boots sinking into soft earth. His chest ached with the contrast. The last time he stood here, the air was thick with smoke. The ground charred, the sky choked black. Now the land breathed again, as if the fire had burned everything but left behind a seed. He pressed a hand against the canyon wall, feeling the coolness of the rock. "How?" he murmured, though no one could answer. Ashfire walked ahead without tether or command, his steps slow but deliberate. He stopped beneath a twisted cottonwood tree that looked older than the canyon itself, its roots clawing deep into the soil. He bent his head and pawed the ground. Jonah ran forward, dropping to his knees, scraping at the dirt with his hands. He unearthed a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, worn and brittle. His breath caught. "Dad!" Ethan knelt beside him. Together they unwrapped it, revealing a journal bound in cracked leather. The name on the inside cover stopped Ethan cold. Caleb Walker. His brother's handwriting curved across the page, familiar even after decades. He turned the brittle paper carefully, each entry more haunting than the last. Notes about the ridge, sketches of trails, and finally words written in hurried strokes. "If I disappear, it means the land kept me. I am not gone. I am part of what remains." Ethan's hands trembled. The desert air thickened around him. He could almost hear Caleb's voice in those words, see his brother's hand pressing the ink down fast, urgent. He closed his eyes, and the silence of the canyon wrapped around him, heavy, but not cruel. Jonah touched his father's arm. "He didn't die, Dad. He changed." The stallion stood over them, shadow cast long in the fading light. His dark eyes seemed to burn with recognition. Ethan lifted his gaze to meet them, and for a heartbeat he swore Caleb looked back, steady, familiar, carrying a warmth that both broke and healed him at once. His throat closed, but the words forced themselves out. "You found your way back." The canyon wind rose, circling them, lifting dust and leaves in a slow spiral. It hummed like a voice caught between worlds. Lila pressed a hand to her chest, eyes wide. "This isn't just memory," she whispered. "This is the land giving him back." Ethan pressed the journal to his chest, tears spilling freely. The years of silence, of blame, of guilt. All of it cracked open, spilling into the earth. "I left you once," he whispered into the wind. "I won't leave you again." Ashfire lowered his head until his muzzle brushed Ethan's shoulder. The weight was real, solid, alive, yet carried something more, a tether to the brother he thought he'd lost. Jonah wrapped his arms around both horse and father, holding them as the canyon light faded to gold. When they finally turned to leave, Ethan glanced back. The canyon seemed to glow faintly, its walls lit by the last threads of sunset. He felt no dread this time, only presence. Caleb was here, not as a ghost chained to the past, but as something resurrected through memory, through land, through the eyes of a scarred Mustang. The walk back to camp was silent, but full. Every step carried weight and release. Ethan no longer felt like a man dragging grief behind him. He felt like a man carrying a story forward. The desert gave them back to San Isidro with a quiet gentleness, as if the land itself had finished what it needed to say. The truck rattled into town days later, dust clinging to its sides, the trailer behind it carrying Ashfire not as a prisoner, but as something closer to kin. Jonah leaned out the window, the journal pressed tight against his chest. His face carried exhaustion, but also a brightness that hadn't been there before. Lila followed in her SUV, her expression calm, watchful, as though she too had been changed by the canyon's silence. Neighbors gathered as they rolled past, lifting hands in cautious waves. Whispers traveled quickly. The walkers had gone to the ridge, and they had come back with more than they left. No one asked questions aloud, but their eyes carried them. Ethan met those looks without flinching. For the first time in 30 years, he didn't feel weighed down by what he carried. The button was still in his pocket, the journal safe in Jonah's hands, but the burden of guilt had shifted. It was no longer a chain. It was a story to be told. At the ranch, Ethan unsaddled Ashfire and let him loose in the pasture. The stallion lifted his head, nostrils flaring, ears tuned to the horizon. He walked the fence line slowly, each step deliberate, before settling beneath the cottonwood tree, as if he had always belonged there. Jonah slipped into the pasture and lay against his side, harmonica resting in his lap. Ashfire did not move away. He lowered his head and breathed into the boy's hair, a bond sealed beyond breaking. That evening, the house filled with a stillness Ethan hadn't felt in decades. Not empty silence, but peace. He placed Caleb's journal in a wooden box, setting it beside the old photograph of two brothers laughing in sunlight. Lila sat at the table, her eyes on Ethan as he closed the lid. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said softly. Ethan nodded. His voice was rough when he answered. He found a way home, through the land, through the horse, through us. As the sun set, the ranch bathed in gold. Ethan saddled Ashfire one final time, the leather worn but mended, Caleb's name etched into every stitch. He rode slowly across the field, not to conquer, not to break, but to honor. Every shift in the stallion's body felt familiar, like an echo carried across decades. At the far edge, Ethan dismounted, pressed Caleb's button into the soil, and whispered, "You can rest now, brother. You're home." Ashfire stood beside him, lowering his head until his forehead touched Ethan's. For a long moment, man and horse breathed as one. Jonah watched from the fence, his small hands clutching the journal, tears bright in his eyes, but his mouth curved in the faintest smile. When Ethan walked back across the field, the weight was gone from his stride. He felt the land breathing with him, no longer haunted, but alive. Birds darted from the cottonwood, and the desert smelled of rain, though no clouds marked the sky. That night, Ethan sat on the porch, Jonah asleep inside, Lila quietly clearing dishes in the kitchen. The stars burned clear, and the wind carried only the sound of grass shifting. Ashfire stood at the fence, watching the horizon. But when Ethan whispered, "You found your way home," the stallion turned his head, eyes soft, steady. Ethan smiled, the first true smile in years, and added, "So did I." The desert exhaled, long and low, as if it too had been waiting for this homecoming. And now, I want to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. It means more than words. Don't forget to subscribe, because the desert holds many more secrets, and every story we share here is a new chance to heal, to remember, and to believe again. Stay with us. The next tale is already waiting.